My name is Layla, and I need you to understand something before I begin. I was a good woman, a faithful wife. For 15 years, I'd kept my vows, honored my marriage, and played the part of the perfect stepmother. But goodness, I learned that night is just another word for pretending. It was October when the storm hit our small coastal town. The kind of storm that makes you remember how small you really are, how fragile the walls we build around ourselves truly are. My husband, David, had been called away on business again. Always business, always somewhere else, always leaving me in that big, empty house with nothing but silence and the ghost of what we used to be. But I wasn't alone that night. Aiden was there. Aiden, my 25-year-old stepson, David's boy from his first marriage. The one who'd grown up while I wasn't looking, who'd transformed from that sullen teenager into something else entirely. Something dangerous. The power went out at exactly 8:47 p.m. I remember because I was watching the clock, counting down the minutes until I could reasonably go to bed and pretend this day had never happened. The house plunged into darkness, and suddenly the silence that had felt oppressive became charged with possibility. I fumbled for candles, my hands shaking not from the cold, but from something else, something I didn't want to name. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling windows and doors, and I could hear Aiden moving around upstairs, his footsteps heavy on the old wooden floors. When he came down, he was different. The boy I'd known was gone, replaced by this man, who seemed to fill the entire room with his presence. His dark hair was tousled, his shirt clinging to his chest in a way that made my mouth go dry. And those eyes, God, those eyes that had always been too knowing, too intense, they were fixed on me like I was the only thing in the world worth looking at. "Power's out," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been amusement. "Phones are dead. What else is there to do but drink?" He tossed me a bottle of wine, expensive wine, the kind David kept for special occasions that never seemed to come. I should have said no. Should have suggested we read by candlelight or play cards or do any of the 1,000 innocent things that reasonable people do during power outages. Instead, I caught that bottle and took a long, desperate sip. The wine stained my lips dark red, and I saw Aiden's eyes follow the movement with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "Truth or dare," he said, settling onto the couch across from me. The candlelight played across his features, turning him into something mythical, something dangerous. "Come on, Lila, just to pass the time," I should have laughed. Should have told him we were too old for such games. But the wine was already working its magic, loosening the tight control I'd kept on myself for so long. And there was something in his voice, something that made it sound less like a game and more like a challenge. "Truth," I said, because I thought it was safer. How wrong I was. His smile was slow, predatory. "How long has it been since someone touched you?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face burn, felt the careful mask I'd worn for years begin to crack. Because the answer was written in every lonely night. Every morning I'd woken up reaching for someone who wasn't there. Every moment I'd stood in front of the mirror and wondered if I was still a woman or just a ghost haunting my own life. 3 years, I whispered, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. 3 long years since your father even looked at me like I was a woman. The air between us crackled with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Aiden leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine, and I saw something shift in his expression, hunger, maybe, or recognition. As if he'd been waiting for this moment, this confession, for longer than I could imagine. I know, he said softly, and those 2 words contained entire worlds of meaning. I stood up abruptly, the wine making me dizzy, or maybe it was the way. He was looking at me. I needed space, needed air, needed to think, but he followed me, moving like a predator stalking prey, until I found myself backed against the wall near the fireplace. This is inappropriate, I said, but my voice was breathless, unconvincing even to my own ears. Then why haven't you walked away? He asked, and his fingers, those long, artist's fingers that I'd watched grow from boy-soft to man-strong, brushed against my wrist. I shivered, but I didn't pull away, couldn't pull away. Because he was right. I could have walked away at any moment, could have gone to my room, locked the door, waited out the storm like a reasonable person. But I didn't want to be reasonable. For the first time in years, I wanted to be reckless. I've watched you, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. For years, the way you bite your lip when you're nervous, how you cross your legs when you think no one's looking, the way you touch your throat when you're thinking about something you shouldn't. And as he spoke, I realized I was doing exactly that. My hand had crept up to my throat, my fingers tracing the pulse point there. He caught my wrist, his thumb brushing over my skin, and I thought I might die from the sensation. Every word was a sin, I tell you now, looking back. And I wanted him to keep talking. Do you know what I think about? He continued, his body moving closer until I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I think about what it would be like to touch you, really touch you. Not the careful, polite touches we've shared over the years, the handshakes, the shoulder pats, the hugs that lasted half a second too long. My breath was coming faster now, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Aiden ... I think about what you'd sound like, he said, his lips near my ear now, his whisper barely audible over the rain. What you'd taste like, what you'd feel like pressed against me in the dark. And then, as if summoned by his words, a massive thunderclap shook the house. The candle flickered once, twice, and went out, plunging us into complete darkness. In that darkness, everything changed. His hands found me in the blackness, and I don't know who moved first, him or me. But suddenly we were kissing, desperate and hungry, like people starving for something they'd never tasted. His mouth was hot against mine, demanding, and I gave him everything he asked for and more. My back hit the wall, and his body pressed against mine, solid and warm and completely, utterly male. I could feel every muscle, every plane of his chest, the rapid beat of his heart that matched my own. His hands tangled in my hair, tilting my head back so he could kiss me deeper, harder, until I thought I might drown in the sensation. We can't. I whispered against his lips, even as my hands clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer. We already are, he growled, and the sound sent fire racing through my veins. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating us for just a moment, his dark eyes wild with want, my own face flushed and desperate. I saw us as if from outside myself, a woman and a man, no longer bound by the roles we'd played, no longer pretending to be anything other than what we were in that moment. Two people who needed each other more than they needed air. What happened next? The storm raged outside, wind howling like all the demons of hell, but inside that house, we were the real tempest. We were destruction and creation, sin and salvation, all wrapped up in desperate touches and whispered confessions. He lifted me, carried me to the couch, and in the flickering light of the dying fire, we crossed every line we'd ever drawn. His hands knew exactly where to touch, exactly how to make me gasp and arch and beg for more. And God help me, I gave him everything. Every secret place, every hidden desire, every part of myself I'd locked away for so long I'd forgotten. It existed. We made love like the world was ending, like we were the only two people left alive, the only two people who mattered. And maybe in that moment we were. Time became meaningless. The storm could have lasted hours or days. I wouldn't have known the difference. All I knew was the weight of his body against mine, the sound of his breathing in my ear, the way he whispered my name like a prayer and a curse all at once. When we finally collapsed together, exhausted and sated, I lay there listening to his heartbeat and wondering what the hell I'd just done. But even then, even knowing how wrong it was, I couldn't bring myself to regret it, because for the first time in years, I felt alive. Dawn broke like a reluctant witness, pale light filtering through the windows and revealing the aftermath of our storm. The power had returned sometime during the night, and the house hummed with normal electricity once again. But nothing would ever be normal again. I stood at the window, wearing his shirt and nothing else, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked the same but felt completely different. Like everything had been washed clean and dangerous all at once. Regrets? He asked from the doorway, his voice rough with sleep and something else, uncertainty. Maybe, or fear. I turned to look at him, this man who had been my stepson but was now something else entirely.
Something indefinable and precious and completely forbidden.
His hair was tousled, his chest bare, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made my heart clench. I should have said yes. Should have lied and pretended that what we'd shared was a mistake, a moment of madness brought on by wine and storms and loneliness. Should have built the walls back up, stronger and higher than before. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth written in every line of his face. This wasn't just lust or forbidden attraction. This was something deeper, something that had been building for years without either of us acknowledging it. Not a single one, I whispered, and the words felt like a benediction and a damnation all at once. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling me into his arms like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold me tight enough. And maybe I would have. Maybe the reasonable part of me would have reasserted itself, would have reminded me of all the reasons why this was impossible. But in his arms, I felt complete for the first time in years. Felt like the woman I'd forgotten I could be, desired, cherished, alive with possibility. What happens now? I asked, my face pressed against his shoulder. I don't know, he admitted, his hands stroking my hair. But I can't go back to pretending. Can't pretend I don't want you, don't need you. Can't pretend that last night didn't change everything. And he was right. Some lines once crossed, you can never step back over. Some storms once weathered leave you forever changed. I was no longer the woman who'd gone to bed that night, just as he was no longer the boy I'd tried to see him as. We were something new, something dangerous, something that would complicate everything we thought we knew about love and family and the rules we live by. The sound of tires on gravel broke the spell. David's car in the driveway, returning from his business trip a day early. The real world came crashing back in, bringing with it all the complications and consequences we'd been ignoring. Aiden tensed in my arms, and I felt him start to pull away. But I held on just for a moment longer, memorizing the feel of him against me. Whatever happens, I whispered, last night was real. What we have, it's real. He nodded, his eyes fierce with promise and pain. This isn't over, Lila. This is just the beginning. And as I watched him grab his clothes and disappear up the stairs, as I heard David's key in the lock and his cheerful, "I'm home," echoing through the house, I knew he was right. Some storms pass, leaving nothing but puddles and broken branches in their wake. But others, the real ones, the ones that matter, they change the landscape forever. They carve new channels, create new possibilities, wash away old boundaries, and leave you standing in a world that's been remade. The storm that brought Aiden and me together was that kind of storm. And as I stood there in his shirt, David's footsteps approaching, I realized I was ready for whatever came next. Because some lines, once crossed, don't just change where you stand, they change who you are. And I was no longer the woman who'd been content to live half a life, to pretend that desire was something to be ashamed of, to accept loneliness as the price of respectability. I was someone new now, someone dangerous, someone who knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to reach for it, consequences be damned. The storm had passed, but the woman it left behind, she was just getting started. Some secrets are too big to keep forever, some desires too strong to deny. And some storms, the ones that matter, they don't just change the weather, they change everything. That's what I learned the night the lights went out. That's what I discovered in the arms of a man I shouldn't have wanted but couldn't live without. That's the truth I carry with me now, dangerous and beautiful and completely, utterly mine. Some lines, once crossed, become the path you were always meant to walk. And I've never looked back.